In ICEMAN, I'm using a cradle to gate analysis because, in any kind of product, it's really difficult to determine how in the future people will recycle it if they do. So, I thought it would be a better way to measure the carbon footprint would be, when that product is made and when it leaves the factory. What happens afterwards is something that possibly we could deal with, in the future when the whole concept of, life cycle analysis develops further.
That was right from the middle of this week's episode, where our guest shares his view on developing a new framework and a carbon label. Stay tuned for a very insightful conversation. Hello and a big warm welcome to yet another episode on the Mission Shunya podcast. I am glad to have you back on the podcast today. Hope you're doing well. It's just me today. The co-host is on a break but will surely join again very soon for yet another special episode maybe. This week we are back to discussing an interesting and a relevant topic around the theme of global net zero carbon economy transition. We have spoken about energy in great depth in the past, but one topic that is very intense but covered less is around buildings and construction. On this episode, we have our guest who is an expert when it comes to working on decarbonization of the built environment. Our guest, in fact, has significant experience in building certifications, and most importantly, he has come up with his own framework and label to take it beyond the construction sector and put it to a wider use. So, without further ado, let's welcome our guest.
Hello, my name is Frank Dalene. I'm a serial entrepreneur. I'm a builder. I own many companies, and I founded a concept called ICEMAN, which is a labeling system that can be put on packaging that's market-based and can reduce the greenhouse gases and help solve our climate crisis.
So Frank, let's begin with your story. You have done a lot of things in the sector, especially in the construction and sustainability around construction. So what's your journey been like? Were you into construction all through, or how did you get here?
I'm originally born in Norway, and part of our culture in Norway is about taking responsibility and being a good steward to the environment. So I founded the business 43 years ago, and we've always been involved in green building way before they call it green building. We've always focused on energy efficiency, reducing air infiltration, and adopting emerging technologies as they were coming up, whatever it was, whether it was structural, whether it was energy efficiency technologies. But we were always early adopters, and we build in the Hamptons, so our clients have good budgets where they can use some of these technologies as they were emerging, and that incentivized me to form this not-for-profit organization called the Hamptons Green Alliance. And it's a group of people from the trades who get together to collaborate to build groundbreaking projects, green projects. And from that is where the ICEMAN concept came from. And it was in a house that we did that we wanted to be carbon neutral in the construction stage. And there was no system. So, I adopted the system of the greenhouse gas protocol, which is developed by the World Resources Institute. And I applied that to construction. And then we had a third party that certified, and it was the first building in the world to be certified carbon neutral.
Wonderful.
We as a company ourselves became carbon neutral. We had a carbon audit. We became carbon neutral, and the major subcontractors became carbon neutral also. So it was a great project. It was the largest LEED Platinum home. That's U.S. Green Building Council LEED Platinum, and out of that, because construction is manufacturing. Out of that, I thought about creating a label that could be put on packaging that could indicate the carbon footprint of the making of that product all the way down the supply chain to where the natural resource came out of the ground. Very similar to the same way that we measured the carbon footprint in the construction stage of building, all the embedded energy, all the embodied energy in the materials, and and then I mathematically converted that to an indexing system that
Mm.
can, from 1 to 100, that can be easily understood by the consumer. So that's important because what we need to do is make sure that we get a lot of participation, and that people understand what that means. And once they understand that, then we can allow the markets to assist in solving the climate change crisis and reducing the carbon footprint.
Wonderful. That's a good short background about your work that you've done. And before we get to ICEMAN framework in detail, why is construction sector so important in the global emissions overview? Why is construction very important? And when you got started 20 or 30 years before this, it wouldn't have been a major issue. But what was your motivation at that point to focus on decarbonizing the construction space and looking at it in a big picture?
Yeah, that's a great question. In worldwide, about 40% of the carbon emissions worldwide come from buildings. So, that's low hanging fruit. And the way we've been building buildings for years it has improved in the way we've improved the energy efficiency. So that was that was what incentivized me actually to get involved in this.
Moving on from construction to the bigger framework for having like a carbon label, how did Iceman framework develop? And did you start with the construction and then develop the overall framework and label?
Yes, we that house that I told you about that we built, we measured the carbon footprint of that construction stage of building, which is essentially a life cycle analysis.
Mm.
And the carbon footprint is added up from all the components and all the materials that make up that product. And it's a very simple concept. It's an application of a science and a standard that has already developed and become accepted worldwide, the Greenhouse Gas Protocol. And we use that and to put that on and to convert that into an indexing system that could be put on a label on a product. And one illustration that I use is organic products and understanding how in the United States change happens from the grassroots level. It's the consumer and the people that really drive change and that give our legislators the political capital to make that change. So when we see the organic label, that happened at the grassroots level, and it became so popular and so big that the government stepped in to standardize it. So what I realized is that because ICEMAN, which I developed, includes all manufactured products, that I would need to get the government involved in the beginning before it started, so they can have input on that. And I believe that's really important. That's part of what I've been working on.
Now, you did mention about the life cycle analysis, and there is a protocol, the greenhouse gas protocol. Now, Iceman obviously, I think, incorporates the life cycle analysis, but are there any major differences or any value additions to the Iceman framework?
Well, in life cycle analysis, you have a couple of ways that people look at the carbon emissions. You have cradle to gate, which is when that product leaves the factory. Then you have cradle to cradle, and that's when a product can be totally recycled into the same into the same product. The first illustration I saw of that was actually with carpet and the carpet industry, where they were able to recycle and pull out the nylon fibers from the carpet and the backing and recycle everything into making new carpet. So then you have cradle to grave, which is analyzing the carbon footprint from the beginning to when that is disposed of. So put into a landfill or recycled again in some way. I'm in Iceman. I'm using a cradle to gate analysis because in any kind of product, it's really difficult to determine how in the future people will recycle it if they do.
Hmm.
So, I thought it would be a much a better way to measure the carbon footprint would be, when that product is made and when it leaves the factory. What happens afterwards is something that, possibly we could deal with, in the future when the whole concept of, life cycle analysis develops further. And the problem is that, when we did it in the HGA house, that's that house that we measured the carbon footprint, and we did not have life cycle analysis on a lot of the products. So, for example, a refrigerator, we didn't have a life cycle analysis for that to put into our calculations. So, but we did know the materials that make up a refrigerator. So what we did is we took the materials themselves, and we had a starting point, and I called it, a stage one analysis. And until, life cycle analysis develops further, where we have a life cycle analysis on every product, which would make it much easier to implement something like this. We're starting from, just like the way the greenhouse gas protocol started. In the beginning, they were only talking about a scope 1 and a scope 2 analysis, and then as it developed and people got accustomed to the way it measures the carbon footprint, they went further to a scope 3, which
Correct.
Goes deeper into where the carbon emissions come from. But in the beginning, they took the major part of it, the lowest hanging fruit, which was the scope 1 and scope 2. I'm doing the same thing. So, and I'm hoping that as it develops, and we are seeing it develop, because from the requirements in other parts of the world, there's requirements to measure the carbon footprint of products, with cap and trade in Europe, for example. We'll see more and more of life cycle analysis, and then we will be able to use that data to input into our calculations in ICEMAN.
That's interesting. Yes, as you rightly said, there's a lot of positive projects that are happening, positive government regulations that are favoring estimating carbon in products. So, one approach, as you said, is to have the cradle to gate approach. But the key differentiating factor, like as I understand, is to have a carbon label on the product, be it any product. You mentioned about the carpet industry, but you are looking at this framework being deployed in all industries and having one carbon label on the product, right?
Yes. The importance of that is because, I believe that in the United States, when Europe adopted the Kyoto Protocol, which brought in cap and trade, it was defeated unanimously both in the U.S. Senate and the House. So, and there's many reasons for that, and people have many reasons for why it was defeated, but I believe mostly it was because of our free market economy, and in free markets, we do not, in the United States, we do not take well to mandates, for example. So, and change happens from the grassroots level, and it's the market forces that I believe are very powerful in creating change. And I use the example in the book. I use the example about in 2008 when we had the economic collapse, and we had biggest companies which were too big to fail. They did fail.
Correct.
And they would have failed, except that the government infused capital into these companies to help them survive. But that's how brutal market forces are, and it's, I also refer to this same an illustration in nature, for example. So nature is cruel, right? So, I cry when I see the nature show and I see the lion, killing the baby gazelle. That's cruel, and it's part of the natural cycle and the cycle of life, right? So if we can harness those market forces for something good, instead of having something evil like the collapse of the economy, if we can just give that information and that data to the consumer, allow the consumer to make that choice, and put pressure on the corporations. There was a recent study. I had somebody on one of my podcasts that did a study that showed that 78% of the people in the United States believe that corporations aren't doing enough to reduce their carbon footprint. So the consumer, is already being educated. They're already putting pressure on corporations. We're seeing this with ESG requirements, and this is becoming now more and more acceptable, and the consumer is becoming more and more educated, and that's a great thing but we have to give them the tool actually by which to make a decision, and that is
Correct.
what is the carbon footprint of that product. And I really believe that if we can give that information to the consumer will make the right choice. Just like they do with organic products, and they're concerned about their health. So they're even willing to pay more for organic products. And the same could be true also in reducing greenhouse gases. And I think it'll have a greater effect than creating mandates, especially in this country.
That is true. And as you rightly said, there's a lot of activity that's going on. And you personally have been leading a lot of efforts in this space. You have the ICEMAN podcast, and also you have the book, Decarbonize the World. Now, how far has this framework come, and what do you think is holding back from this framework and the general label being taken up in a bigger way? You did mention that there needs to be a political will, but what else is holding this back?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And I've been doing a lot of groundwork meeting with legislators in Washington. And what's interesting is because it's a market-based system, I have no political opposition, right? I've met with the senators Republican senators on the Senate Committee on the Environment, and they love the idea. And they've even helped me get high-level appointments into the EPA and the DOE, EPA and the Department of Energy. And when I've met with these senior level people, they love the idea too. What needs to be done? So the EPA also has a mechanism. I have 5 certified service marks from the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office protecting this concept. It's an original idea. And the EPA has a mechanism by which to form a public-private partnership with somebody like me to develop this. And so I've met with these people, but they said they need a legislative act to where the government and the administration can allocate personnel to the EPA and fund the EPA to help implement something like this. That doesn't have to be a lot of work. The EPA is already the larger companies are already reporting their carbon footprint to the EPA. The smaller companies, it's still voluntary. But that's the only thing that the government would need to require these companies to do is just to report their carbon emissions. And then once we have that data, then we can convert that into an index that can be put on packaging. And to have that agreement with the government where we can share that information and work together, with the private sector together with the government, and to allow the consumer to make that choice and the market forces to have an effect, I think is what's going to make it work far better than creating mandates.
Fair. As you rightly said, there's a small gap, access to data, access to the right data. And once you have this coming into place, the label can be more accurate. Am I right?
Yes. And what I need to do, and I haven't done yet, because the first step actually is to get this agreement with government and to have this legislative act. But then what we need to do to establish that baseline for the zero in the index, we have to establish that basis for every product. And to establish that basis is kind of a simple process. It's not a difficult thing, but it's a large undertaking. But it is taking the worst case scenario in creating a product. And I'll give you an example. So in our construction business, we use a lot of concrete, right? So there are 2 processes to create concrete. One is what's called a wet kiln process, and the other is the dry kiln process. Now, the dry kiln process emits less carbon emissions than the wet kiln process. So we would take the worst case scenario, and then when a company is using the dry kiln, they would have then an advantage and a better carbon index. And then also, the one of the biggest forms of energy that's used in manufacturing is electricity, right?
Correct.
If a corporation is in a renewable grid, let's say, we had I was involved in business upstate New York, up in St. Lawrence County. Now there they have a hydroelectric plant that's shared with Canada, and that electric grid there is 100% renewable hydroelectric, and even the electrical cost was much cheaper than in other places in New York, for example,
Mhm.
Long Island. So we were paying up there 23. We were paying up there 3 cents a kilowatt hour. Where here on Long Island, we were paying 23 cents a kilowatt hour. So the advantages, and this is why I say in the book that when you adopt renewable energy, there's a financial benefit for doing that. So it's good for the company. It's good for the company to make increases profits, or they can, instead of increase just taking the profits, they can reduce the cost of the product, and that actually has a different impact than what we see in Europe with cap and trade. Because with cap and trade, it adds a carbon tax to products.
Correct.
And this is what everybody fears here in the United States, and why they think it may be bad for the economy. But if we allow the consumer to decide, and the corporations, have a financial benefit by adopting renewable energy, or making their buildings more energy efficient, or even their manufacturing more efficient, and where it uses less energy, all of that will impact their carbon footprint and their carbon index number to where it's something that's more competitive. And that competitive advantage actually is what's going to make this work, and it's going to really have a great impact in reducing the overall carbon emissions.
That's wonderful. That's very good to know about the progress that you have made. Frank, on a final note, you did mention about a lot of work, the groundwork that you have done in the US. But what about the work outside of US? Are you looking for any partners? Have you spoken to a few people or private sector? And what's the progress like, or what's the reception like to the ICEMAN framework outside of the US?
Yeah, that's a great question too, and I'm willing to work with anybody actually to implement this. And I the one of the greatest privileges I had was being invited to speak at the Zero Emissions Conference in Oslo, Norway, and it got my presentation there got publicity in the newspapers, and it triggered this. It allowed me to work with the Norwegian Parliament actually to see if the Norwegian Parliament would be willing to be that, and the country of Norway being willing to be the first country to adopt something like this. So they were, but they still did not have same with the United States, did not have the political capital to do it.
Mhm.
And but I believe that the administration now, and the way the consumer awareness has been increasing, I think now is like the perfect time to do that, and I think it's all ripe to set this up. And anybody that's willing to help me to do that, I'm open to what anybody's ideas into helping make this work, because I really believe that it's something that's really powerful, because we really have to do a lot of work. The UN has bringing the countries together for years, since 1992 when they had the first Earth Summit at Rio, and
Mhm.
the last Conference of Parties in Glasgow in last November, and they considered it a failure actually, because the countries are not getting together, and there's a lot of good reasons for that, because you have political reasons, you have different economic systems, you have different cultures, and to get everybody together, would be, they're finding out to be, almost impossible to do. So, what everybody has in common, and and because of globalization, we're buying products from China, we're buying products from other countries in the world. And when, our government could say if we're importing products from China, for example, that China has to have a carbon index on its products to be able to be imported into the United States. So that would influence, and that would help put pressure on companies in other countries that are exporting their products to the United States to then disclose what that carbon footprint is and further put pressure on companies from all over the world.
That's fair. I mean, that's the reason like why podcasts like this also aim to do is to spread the message of the good work that people are doing from around the world and see if there is more traction from outside the home markets. And I hope, just like how your voice was heard in Norway, I hope the message reaches a wider audience and hopefully you will get some traction. Because I did read the book, I did read the framework, and it is definitely very interesting. So I will definitely put the links to connect with you, links to the book and the podcast on the show notes section of this episode.
Great. I also have a website that helps to promote the book. And it's very simple. It's frankdalene.com. That's Frank, F-R-A-N-K, Dalene, D-A-L-E-N-E.com. So on that website, it has my podcast. It has interviews on other people's podcasts, radio interviews. I've written many blogs and papers that we've put on there to further, educate people about, how ICEMAN works. So there's a lot of information there. And I invite people to go onto that website and check it out further too.
Wonderful. I'll definitely put the link in the show notes section of this episode. So Frank, it was wonderful to catch up with you on this topic, something that's very different, but it is very important to talk about this topic. So thanks for taking time to join me on this podcast today.
And thank you for having me on.
That was a wrap on yet another insightful conversation. The big action item at the end of this episode is about measuring what matters. Unless we measure and quantify the amount of carbon embodied into whatever we consume, we wouldn't know if our actions are having a positive impact. A classic example, again, with reference to an earlier episode, is around organic farming. That is, if we are getting a particular vegetable all through the year, we for sure know that the organic produce has definitely been sourced from a far place. A good label, like the carbon label, building on from the framework like ICEMAN, as proposed by Frank, could go a long way in helping us understand this better. Let me know what you think of topics like these, or leave your general feedback. missionshunya@gmail.com is the ID. Of course, you can tag Mission Shunya across social media channels, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter. The handle is @MissionShunya. The links as shared by Frank will be in the show notes section of this podcast and also on the webpage missionshunya.com. So make sure to check them. And finally, a special thanks to Jacob and team at TerraGeneration.com for creating the beautiful artworks that you see on each episode. Terra Generation is a content agency specialized in telling stories in climate, biodiversity, and sustainability. I will be back in 2 weeks' time with yet another insightful conversation. So make sure you subscribe to the podcast if you haven't done that yet. With that, this is Girish Shivakumar signing off. And as always, thank you for listening.